Well, this had to happen at some point. Please have mercy, Viacom. I'm an innocent soul. This is just a fair use project. There's no need to unleash your copyright nukes. And you, Kappa, I see you raising your claws. This is not intended for kids. So you can take your vicious instinct elsewhere. You hear me? And you, Viacom? We're good? You're good? Good. But yeah, this is the first time I'll be talking about SpongeBob. But first, a quick story. Throughout my childhood, I grew up quite poor. We couldn't afford the luxury of cable TV, and so we never got to experience much of those big-name channels, particularly Nickelodeon. But I wasn't completely in the dark when it came to the Nick brands growing up. I still got to see some of these shows via DVD releases, or watching them on the air while hanging with friends. And I, and everyone around me, always showed the most fascination for SpongeBob. I still remember some of the fond memories I had watching through the show during its golden years. And I definitely remember the hype that came from the first movie at the time. It was released in theaters back in 2004. And as the late Steven Hillenburg, the franchise creator, was saying at the time, he and many others were planning on this movie to serve as the finale to the series. But I'll go more into that later. I have a feeling this may be a surprise to some, but this movie actually happened to be my first real SpongeBob experience. Before this movie, I never saw any of the show, or at least I never saw any of the episodes in their entirety, which as you can imagine led to quite the confusion when the episodes came up. But the movie was the first installment of the franchise I had the chance to watch from beginning to end. And it was back when it was brand new in theaters, so of course, the experience was a pretty big deal to me. And it sparked my interest to hunt down the rest of the show up to that point. Alright, back to the movie itself. This movie showed us at great length that it was possible to take a lot of the elements from the show, put them into a greatly extended story, and still make it work with the roots that made the show enjoyable in the first place. But now these roots are set to a much greater scale, as this was the biggest adventure SpongeBob went through at the time, as he and Patrick made their way to the deadly Shell City in an attempt to save Neptune's crown. By assumption, that sounds like it would just be enough to fill the length of an average episode on its own, and with that kind of structure in mind, it probably could have been enough. So of course there had to be a lot more needed to give it more of a movie's length, and these writers had a trick up their sleeve to meet that length. They had a gimmick for the story, and this gimmick came in many forms, but they all led to one moral. A moral that a good portion of the target audience is bound to relate to. Don't feel ashamed of being a kid, and you should be happy with who you are. They played this moral in just about every scene, showing the impact it could have, and while said impact may come off negative in some ways, it's how you handle it that really matters. Which was what SpongeBob learned through his whole journey. And he still managed to survive Shell City, and much more. And that's not all. There were other elements thrown in to help enhance the length, and the aesthetic for the movie. There were these brand new characters, or new enough I should say. Like, yeah, we've seen King Neptune back in season 1, so I guess they were trying to go for an alternate version of him or something? Like, this guy had a daughter, much unlike in the show, where he had a son. But besides that, there were characters who I know for certain were never seen before by that point. And some of them were given their own respectable celebrity voice actors at the time, and they all fit in with the story and had something impactful and memorable. There were even these new locations for the story, like Shell City, of course, the Goofy Goober Diner, the Krusty Krab 2, the Trench, and the Thug Tug.
You all know the rules.
You know the rules, and so do I.
Of course, the story itself, even with all these new details added, was still gonna need a little more enhancement. And my god, this told me at the time, and even to this day, that the writers knew what they were doing, as they rolled up their sleeves and went all out on this. And in the end, they gave us a story that slapped. With Neptune having frozen Mr. Krabs, he's left defenseless from Plankton stealing the formula, which gives him the chance to lure everyone to the chum bucket and give them his own merch. Which turns out to be connected to a mind control device. Yeah, the writers certainly weren't afraid to add some unsettling elements to this movie. I too feel the chills from these scenes looking back at them. But as some of you may know by now, back then I would have, and did, eat all this up. I would have taken quite an odd fascination with this plot. And needless to say, this was the farthest Plankton has ever gone. He has not just the formula, but the whole town at his command. This has gotta be the most threatening Plankton's ever been. And I hate to say it, but it probably will be too. I mean, there would have to be a lot of effort needed to top this. And with modern censorship and executive standards, it feels like it might be practically impossible to pull that off. But I still have some hope. And the dark themes still don't stop there, as SpongeBob and Patrick end up dying in Shell City. Sure, we've seen death before in the show by that point, but it was usually just for laughs. Here, they added a lot of detail to the scene, with their bodies drying up and slowly withering. Man, this must have been tough for any fan at the time. Granted, my knowledge of the show was bare bones when I first saw this movie, so my reaction wasn't as sad as those around me, but I still felt kinda sad regardless, as I too thought that this was gonna be it for them. But fear not, it's not all dramatic. Being a family film, they had to try and balance it out with some friendly jokes. And the jokes that they included were brilliant. I remember when I first saw the movie, I was falling out of my chair thanks to these jokes. Like the alarm clock gag in the beginning, and the Gooberberry sunrise binge turning into a hangover. Sure, I didn't entirely get the jokes back then, but it was the way they were presented I found so funny back then. And I certainly find them funny now that I actually get the jokes. They were so clever. I might come off biased for saying this, and I think I am biased, but this still stands as my favorite movie in the franchise so far. And it may be because the nostalgia from this one hits me the hardest. But even if that wasn't the case, it still had all these elements that gave it the stability it has to this day. There's just so much about it that works even in these modern years. The only thing I feel didn't age as well in this movie was the celebrities they brought in. I mean, David Hasselhoff still holds up pretty well, even despite his alcoholism, but some of the other celebrities featured here ended up with a bit deeper of a rabbit hole. Like, I'm sure we're all familiar with what Scarlett Johansson, Jeffrey Tambor, and Alec Baldwin ended up doing and going through in the past, but nevertheless, at the time they were still pretty decent inclusions in the cast, and played their characters really well. It certainly helped that the characters themselves were written great too. King Neptune had his fair share of funny moments, Mindy was charming enough, and Dennis made for quite a threatening obstacle. I'd have to say, this movie was incredible at the time, and it's still nice to watch even nowadays. Checking out this movie was quite the first experience for me, and again, this was also what the team had planned to be the finale for the show, so of course you would have expected them to go all out like this. Ironic, isn't it? How what was originally set to be the show's final installment also happened to be the first installment I ever saw. Yes, everyone knows by now that they were planning for this movie to serve as the finale, and Steven was all on board with this too. But as you can imagine, those higher-ups at Nickelodeon saw how much money the franchise was giving them.
We've got to have money.
So they gave Steven the Uno reverse card treatment, and decided to keep the show going. And Steven was not keen with this, as he feared the show would have faced a downward curve from here, which, well, let's just say he wasn't far off. But it didn't really matter to him, since he turned his back on them in the end anyway. And from then on, the shots were called by his production partner, Paul Tibbitt. But even with him in charge, it still didn't stop the unfortunate nosedive the show would end up suffering in the upcoming years. And the newly released episodes at the time would slowly go from bad to worse, and even worse from there with each passing season. In hindsight, I'd say I got pretty lucky when it came to SpongeBob on my end. I stopped watching the show regularly after season 6, and according to reviews, that was when the show really tanked. So thankfully, I managed to dodge a bullet. I just assumed there was going to be no hope for the franchise from that point on. But then, jump cut to 2014 when Paul gave the word that Steven was coming back to the scene. Yes, after so long, he returned. And while there were still quite a handful of duds in the next few seasons afterwards, those later seasons were starting to have a few more silver linings too. And it looked like things were starting to move in a good direction once again. So now that Steven was back on board and the show was slowly moving out of that slump it was once in, it seemed like just as good a time as any to release their next big installment, another SpongeBob movie. Yeah, despite the circumstances, there was a sequel coming out for the SpongeBob movie. Now, just as a warning to some, there are some pretty intense spoilers for this portion, so it'll be best to skip the part if you haven't seen it yet. This new movie was titled Sponge Out of Water, released in theaters back in 2015. I remember when this movie was being advertised pretty much everywhere. But unlike the first movie, I wasn't as excited to go to the theaters for it. And I didn't anyway. Yeah, I knew Steven was on the team again, but even with the fact that he was back on board, I still assumed it would have taken much longer for the franchise to even compare to the quality it once had. Especially since Steven was never given back the top spot in the staff. But it wasn't until a couple weeks ago when I finally decided to give the movie a shot. It was mostly out of sheer curiosity, but I gotta say, this was actually better than I expected. Even though I still preferred the first movie, this movie, much to my surprise, was very doable. They really threw us for a loop with this new character, Burger Beard. At the start, they had him set up to look just like a narrator with some oddly specific personality details, and nothing else besides that. But then he turns out to be the villain too. That's a kind of twist you don't see too often, at least not with that kind of execution, so it was quite a surprise. It adds up with the book he had this whole time. It looks like an average book at first, kept under ancient security, but then it's revealed to be the source of Burger Beard's power, which was what made him so unique and kinda threatening too. It gives off a never-ending story or Death Note kind of vibe, showing what could happen if the book was put in control through the wrong hands. But it was still cleverly disguised while he was reading it, which could lead you to think the plot of the story was already in the past and not at the control of Burger Beard. I haven't seen that many examples of this scenario playing out like that, so it felt kinda fascinating when I got to see it here. As a side note, Burger Beard was played by someone who I think we all know by now, Antonio Banderas, and that had to have been one of the best choices they would have made for this character. He's already proven his worth in a load of other movies, and he fits perfectly here too. In this movie, he takes his usual performance style and morphs it into more of a villainous atmosphere, and it works wonderfully. Despite the choice of making him live action, he still fits in with the SpongeBob franchise. He comes off as a neat villain in general, he's got amusing moments, he's shown he can be a decent threat, but that's mostly due to the book and not himself. But he puts up a decent fight regardless. He's given enough to make him one of the most memorable and interesting villains in the franchise. But as great as he was, I can already tell we'll, unfortunately, never get to see him again. But enough of him, he was just one aspect of the story. Obviously the story itself is gonna be just as good, right? Well, kinda. The story gave us some nice moments and details, but even still I wouldn't say it was as big or investing as what we got from the first movie, and I'm pretty sure the reason for that was that they were all set for the first movie to wrap up the show. But during this movie's production, they already knew the show wasn't going to wrap up anytime soon, so there wouldn't really be as much of a need for a story with an effective theme this time. Mind you, they still go through the trouble of adding a theme and a lesson here too, but it's still nothing too big, as the main theme for this movie was basically teamwork, which can still lead to good morals on its own, and it kinda does here too, but it still feels like a bit of a step down compared to the first movie. You could practically slap this kind of theme on just about any other kids franchise, and there's a good chance the outcome would be roughly the same. Besides the tone, the rest of the story is basically just hit or miss from here. From a distance, I'd have to say most of the story kinda feels like a mashup between some of the older episodes, specifically Life of Crime and FUN, as SpongeBob has to leave town feeling like a criminal. In addition, he and Plankton end up being together for some time, and this I feel can be taken in different ways. Some could say that placing these concepts together could lead to ideal movie material, while others might find it a little concerning that they're recycling concepts for the sake of a story. Sure, they're not bad concepts, and this movie proves they could do something with them together, but seeing how the writers are still making new episode ideas to this day, it's fair to expect they come up with a story that's completely new and can offer enough to make into a movie. But as for me, I'm honestly kind of split in the middle with this debate. Yes, these scenarios were used before, and in pretty memorable episodes I might add, but here they still give us new story elements through it, which help unfold into a unique adventure with some interesting moments and impressive details to it. But I'll go more into those later. So yeah, in general, I can see both ups and downs with this kind of story. And of course there's the characters to back this all up, but first I'd like to uncover the rest of the story for these characters and their actions to make sense. Thanks to the book, Burger Beard has ways to steal the formula without anyone knowing, and Plankton ends up getting the blame. SpongeBob's the only one who can defend him after he saw it disappear too. And without ways to make Krabby Patties, the town pretty much goes into chaos, which leads to the town having a downfall and everyone driving into insanity, and it's all because of a lack of Krabby Patties. Which feels like a callback to another episode, Whatever Happened to SpongeBob. Okay, an odd episode to recycle, but again, they give us something new from it. A more intense and rather fashionable apocalypse throughout the town, which ends up affecting pretty much everyone. Sandy turns into a conspiracy addict, Gary crowns himself Snail King, and Mr. Krabs and Patrick take up a good portion of the force in the mob. As I said before, the main theme they were trying to deliver in this movie was teamwork. And how did that delivery hold up? Did the writer succeed? Well, in a way, yeah. Sure, it may not be as impactful to the audience, and the delivery may not have been as natural or had as smooth of a flow in the story, but it's still a decent lesson to be taught regardless. And they pulled it off fairly well, even when given what they had at the time. The only real criticism I had with the story arc for this theme was that it was depending a bit too much on filler scenes. And some might say the first movie was guilty of that too, but those scenes were never really complete filler. No matter how silly or goof-offish they were, they would all play a part in the story to add on to later scenes and so on. But here, most of the filler is not exactly as impactful, and as a result can be a little easier to forget about. with one of the biggest examples being the scenes with the time machine. The only thing they really got from it was meeting Bubbles, as well as unexpectedly doing him a favor, which leads up to the big beach scenes in the end, but besides that, the time machine didn't really do much else. Putting it together did help strengthen the teamwork theme between SpongeBob and Plankton, which the writers were trying to go for, but besides that, there wasn't much else to it. And honestly, I kinda forgot it even existed after the first time watching. Even while taking notes about it, I still forgot it was there. But I'd have to say the most impressive thing about this movie would have to be the final battle. I remember when they were showing it all over the movie's trailers. And I'm sure the new CG animation might have thrown a few people off at the time, but after the rehydrated release of Battle for Bikini Bottom, I have a feeling the style might feel more natural nowadays. You could definitely tell there was a lot of thought put into this. The superhero designs did a great job fitting with their usual designs and personalities. The fight scene played out a decent length, there wasn't really anything that felt too rushed or dragged out, all these moves were fun to watch, and Plankton gave some decent closure for it. Which I'm sure for some, probably wasn't so easy to see coming, especially given everything else that was happening up to this point. Honestly, this superhero gimmick was really well done, and I kinda wish they did more with it. Well, besides that extremely mediocre game. So thinking about this, I'd still say it was probably good that I didn't see it in theaters. It just feels like something I wouldn't have enjoyed back then, but I would have slowly developed more of a liking toward as time went on. While I still feel the first movie had more value in it, this movie was pretty enjoyable too, and I'm glad I finally took the time to watch it. So now we had two movies, both released in theaters, and with successful results. So naturally, there was bound to be a third movie coming out. Sure enough, there was. And it was called Sponge on the Run. But this came much sooner than we may have expected. Unlike the first and second movie that had an 11-year gap, this movie only had a 5-year wait from the second movie. And on top of that, this movie would end up delivering a lot of changes compared to the first two movies. Some for better, others for not so better. I'm not trying to say this movie was terrible or anything, but it certainly felt like a step down compared to the other movies. One of the first points to bring up on this movie is that it was released in 2020, back at the height of the big, you know what, so theaters weren't really an option. So for many, the only way to see it was online or via DVDs. As a side note, this movie was also one of Steven's final projects, as he unfortunately passed away during production, which also led to some unexpected drama, for reasons I think we all know about by this point, but I'll go more into that later. This movie was also trying out a new CG animation style, and for the most part it's actually kinda charming. It's kinda similar to the CG models in Sponge Out of Water, but with a bit more attention to the smaller details like shading, color, and texture. Like there's more visual depth here than usual, which shows a bit more care being put into this, and I thought it was just a nice touch. But like I said, I liked it for the most part, as there are some characters and objects in the style that can come off unnecessarily unpleasant or in some ways disgusting. And that can take away from some of the appeal, especially if it wasn't intentional, which I feel was the case for some of these. So in this movie, Gary ends up missing after Plankton stole him, so SpongeBob and Patrick have to save him by going through a long road trip. Oh, they're just reusing the first movie's premise, but with have you seen this snail thrown in. And again, that episode and the first movie were great on their own. Plus, like I said before, reusing concepts is fine as long as they can come up with something new for it. And while they also do here, it just comes out very confusing and doesn't feel like it fits with this atmosphere. Even for a SpongeBob concept, most of this just doesn't make sense. And once again, we're given a new villain for this movie, Poseidon, who's said to be the king of the sea. Wait, what? Another one? How many kings does this ocean have? I already tried wrapping my head around the fact there are 2 Neptunes, but now there's a 3rd mermaid king we have to look out for? Sheesh. But nevertheless, he is the new big threat for this movie. And how does he hold up as a villain? Not too bad, I suppose. They could have done worse, but compared to the villains from the previous movies, this one, again, kinda felt like a step down. To be fair, this guy had a more unique motive. He was simply obsessed with his appearance, and went to extreme measures to enhance himself, like using snails for lotion. And that's a pretty creative idea, but I feel his personality was what dragged him down. Sure, they gave him more of a comical side, which is always a plus in this regard, but still he can come off a little insufferable with how obnoxious he acts at times. I'm not trying to say these villains aren't allowed to have goofy moments. I mean, just look at Plankton and Burger Beard. They had some funny moments in their movies, but the problem was they had more of a balance to them. They could be both goofy and threatening. And the fact they had these two sides helped them flesh out and make their scenes feel more important to the story and their screen time. But with Poseidon, his balance just wasn't as stable. He was mostly goofy and barely threatening. Which again, wouldn't feel like that much of a problem if the villains before him hadn't set such high standards. In the end, he just gave off a bit of a crooked first impression. And speaking of first impressions, just like in the other movies, there were some celebrity actors added to the cast. But unlike in those movies where they played characters who not only fit in with the SpongeBob world, also made impacts to the story. But here, these just felt more like confusing cameos. Like you got Keanu Reeves as Sage the Tumbleweed, and Snoop Dogg as... Snoop Dogg.
Smoke weed every day.
Yeah, it may sound cool that they got them for this movie, but how did they hold up as characters? Well, compared to the celebrities we've seen in the other movies, they left much to be desired. Like I said, what made the celebrities work in the other movies was that their characters had more thought put into them, that they had an impact on the movie that allowed the story to keep going. In addition, their presentations gave off the right kind of impression that they'd fit in with the ocean world. Like you could slip these characters into an episode of the show, and they'd mostly fit right in. But here, these characters, needless to say, feel highly out of place. When they were first introduced, I couldn't even tell what they were trying to go for, what they were trying to do, or what was even the thought process. Sure, I know now they were from a dream, so of course things were gonna get weird in their scene, but mostly Snoop Dogg gets that kind of excuse because you never see him after that scene. Keanu, on the other hand, is still around. So, what's up with him? He's just a magic tumbleweed? It just felt more like Snoop and Keanu were there solely for the sake of being there. All Snoop Dogg had was that one song, and that was it for him. So it was easy to forget he was there in the first place. And sure, you could say Sage did make some sort of impact, but that was mostly from the excess screen time he was given. It's like they were giving Keanu any chance to pop up into a scene and spout wisdom to SpongeBob and Patrick. But besides that, he still wasn't much help. All he really does is show how Gary's doing and remind him of their mission, but besides that, it feels like the rest of his scenes would have played out mostly the same, with or without him. And what about Plankton? What was his fate in the end? Mostly nothing.
Wow! Incredible!
Like he went through all this trouble to get the formula, and the moment he gets it, he just gives up and becomes reformed. I feel this climax would have worked a little better had it been given more build-up. Like if there was an extra scene where Plankton tries harder to be happy about having the formula, and we see him trying to sell Krabby Patties, and then fully comes to the realization, instead of just, giving up at the very moment he got it. And not only that, he helps the gang save SpongeBob and Patrick too? Honestly, if it was this easy for Plankton to go through such an extreme flip-flop and change his ways just to save them, then what was the point of him giving Gary to Poseidon in the first place? I know it was to keep SpongeBob out of the way so he could get the formula, but it doesn't feel like it was worth it when it leads to nothing on Plankton's side. And it really doesn't help that he contributes very little to the story from this point onward. And when they do rush to Atlantic City to save SpongeBob and Patrick from their execution, all this builds up to is that part. The Camp Coral samples. Yeah, by now everyone knows the backstory of this movie, and how it was intended to jumpstart the Camp Coral show. And there was the whole issue with the poor timing, how the show was announced sometime after Steven's passing, and everyone thought they were planning this show behind his back or something. I can definitely see how that would come off in poor taste to everyone, regardless of their intention. And just the fact this is supposed to be a prequel show, it feels kinda hollow with the loopholes in the story. Like it didn't have a good start to say the least. Like even though we've seen how SpongeBob met Sandy and Squidward in earlier episodes of the show itself, those scenes were much different than what's shown in Camp Coral. But the writers still insist this is how SpongeBob met them. Unless the writers are trying to tell us this is the way SpongeBob truly met Sandy and Squidward, and he just straight up forgot at one point until sometime after those episodes, I don't see how this could work at all. I'm just going to assume the writers were getting kinda weak from the continuity by this point, but I don't think the Camp Coral bits would have been so bad if they were trying to make that its own thing. Granted, that still wouldn't make the show great, but it could have been more of a saving grace if they kept it separate from the original show's timeline. But seeing how they try to connect it in this movie, I think it's needless to say, but they intended this to be canon. Which based on what we've seen, it just doesn't fit that well. And that's probably where it first crashed. With that in mind, I'm kinda afraid to see where Camp Coral goes from here, but I get this feeling I'll have to see it at one point or another. But it still wasn't all that bad. At least this scene had what I think is the best thing about this movie. The secret to the formula. My god, this song was a bop. It was a total banger and I absolutely love it. I wouldn't say it's my all-time favorite song in the franchise, but it's still a great staple for the songs we've been getting in recent years. It was so catchy and lively, It does a great job showing the flow and energy that this animation style is capable of, and it was just nice to see these characters getting together for this performance. There was a lot I liked about this song, and it was overall a great pick-me-up to an otherwise awkward scene. So the movie ends with the snails being freed and getting new homes in Bikini Bottom, which is nice I suppose, but it makes me wonder where all those snails are now. And for that matter, all this makes me wonder why the movies never made that much of an impact on the show itself. I mean, with all these huge adventures SpongeBob and the gang went on, you'd think at least someone would bring part of it up at some point. And sure, they still make some brief references once in a while, like they sort of brought back the Goofy Goober Diner and Dennis. But what about the other new characters and places they all learned about? You're telling me they forgot about Shell City? Or Burger Beard? Or Atlantic City? Or the Kings? Sure, I can understand if some parts of these movies are never brought up again, like the Krusty Krab 2, or even the Thug Tug. But there's still potential for the writers to bring back, or at least make references to some of these characters' interactions from these movies. Don't you think it would be more of an interesting experience if the movies and the show had a few more connections with each other? Because I sure do. So this brings us to where we are now with SpongeBob. Currently 13 seasons in. Jeez, I've got some catching up to do. And there are a few spin-offs on the side with hit or miss reviews. So if I do end up writing for another SpongeBob video, and I probably will, there's going to be quite another handful of material to go into. Honestly, I wasn't too invested to check out Camp Coral or The Patrick Show, but I have a feeling I probably will anyway in a later video, but just as long as Viacom or YouTube Kids doesn't screw me over with this video. But we'll always have these movies to look back on. The first movie I absolutely loved, even to this day. The second movie was surprisingly decent, and the third one could have had some improvements. But the cinema train still doesn't end here. A while ago, Nick gave the word that there's gonna be even more SpongeBob movies down the line, with one of them called Saving Bikini Bottom, which is supposed to come out next year, and it's said to focus more on Sandy, which sounds like it could have potential, just as long as they don't make her the same way she was in Squirrel Jelly. After that, the next movie's gonna be Search for SquarePants, coming in 2025, and it's said to bring back the Flying Dutchman. But at the moment I don't know anything else about these movies, so I'm not sure what the story's gonna consist of or what else they're gonna give us. But even with my long absence from the franchise, I'm still kind of interested to see where they go with these movies. Sure, there was a bit of a quality drop from Sponge on the Run, but I've still got my hopes they can come up with something impressive with whatever they give us for these next few movies. But like I always say at the end of these videos, we'll soon see, won't we?